My name is Victor Harmon. I'm 52 years old, a former radio engineer, and a Korean War veteran. Life hasn't been the same since I got back from the war. The nights are long, filled with memories I'd rather forget. And the days, well, they're just quiet. Too quiet. My wife, Maggie, says this trip is supposed to help me heal, to get me out of my head and back into the world. She's always been my rock, even when I didn't deserve it. We were driving our old 1956 Airstream cruiser through Nevada. The desert stretched out for miles in every direction, the heat shimmering off the highway like a mirage. Maggie was in the passenger seat, humming some tune she probably heard on the radio years ago. She always hums when she's nervous, but she wouldn't tell me what was bothering her. I figured it was just the heat, or maybe the endless nothingness around us. The plan was simple: drive cross-country and see where the road takes us. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It started when the RV broke down on a lonely stretch of highway near a place called Skeleton Ridge. The engine sputtered and died without warning, leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in reds and oranges, but all I could think about was how far we were from civilization. "Victor," Maggie said softly, "what do we do now?" I grabbed my toolbox from under the seat and stepped outside. The heat hit me like a wall, and the air smelled faintly of something metallic, like burnt wires or old machinery. I popped open the hood and started tinkering with the engine, hoping it was just a loose connection or something simple. That's when we saw him. A man was walking along the side of the highway, his thumb out like he was hitchhiking. He was tall and lean, with a charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Maggie waved at him through the window as he approached. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice smooth and friendly. "Not unless you're a mechanic," I replied without looking up from the engine. He chuckled. "Nope, but I can keep you company while you figure it out." Maggie introduced herself as Margaret. She always uses her full name with strangers, and he told us his name was Leon Rhodes. Said he was heading to California to start fresh after some bad luck back east. There was something about him that put me on edge, but Maggie seemed to like him well enough. By the time I got the engine running again, it was dark out. The stars were bright overhead, but there wasn't a single car in sight for miles. Maggie suggested we let Leon ride with us until we reached the next town. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We drove for another hour before pulling over to camp for the night. The desert air had cooled down by then, and everything felt eerily still. Leon helped me set up a small fire while Maggie cooked dinner inside the RV. As we sat around the fire eating canned beans and crackers, Leon started asking questions about my radio equipment. I'd brought along some custom gear I'd built myself, just something to keep my hands busy during downtime. "You're into radios?" he asked casually. "Used to be," I said. "Worked on military comms during the war." His eyes lit up at that you've got some stories to tell. I didn't answer him right away. Talking about the war wasn't exactly my favorite subject. Later that night, after Maggie had gone to bed, I decided to test out my radio equipment for fun. Leon stayed up with me, watching as I adjusted dials and flipped switches. At first, all we picked up were static and faint signals from distant stations, nothing unusual. But then something strange happened. The static faded, replaced by voices. Our voices. It sounded like a recording of our conversation from earlier that day. Maggie asking what we'd do if we couldn't fix the RV, Leon joking about being terrible with engines, me grumbling about how hot it was outside. What is that?" Leon whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, my hands frozen over the controls. The voices cut off abruptly, replaced by high-pitched tones that made my head throb. Leon winced and covered his ears as I scrambled to turn off the radio. When it finally went silent again, we sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. "Maybe it's just interference," Leon said eventually, though he didn't sound convinced. "Yeah," I muttered. "Maybe." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning brought more questions than answers. When we stepped outside to stretch our legs, we noticed something odd in the dirt around the RV. perfect circles etched into the ground with strange symbols inside them. They looked almost like crop circles, but smaller and more intricate. Maggie bent down to touch one of them, but as soon as her fingers brushed against it, the pattern disappeared like it had never been there at all. Leon crouched beside her, studying where it had been moments before. "That's not normal," he said quietly. "No kidding," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the rising heat of the day. Something wasn't right about this place, or about Leon for that matter, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was just yet. The next day, the heat was relentless, the kind that makes the air shimmer and sticks to your skin like a second layer. Maggie looked pale, but she brushed it off, saying she just needed some water. I didn't push her. She's always been stubborn like that. The RV was running again, but we still needed a few parts to make sure it wouldn't break down on us again. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, so I decided to head there while Maggie and Leon stayed behind with the RV. I didn't like leaving her alone with a stranger, but what choice did I have? She insisted she'd be fine. The drive to town was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars, no animals, not even a bird in the sky, just the endless desert stretching out on either side of the highway. The only sound was the hum of the engine and my own thoughts, which were louder than I wanted them to be. When I finally reached the town, it wasn't much to look at, just a handful of buildings scattered along a dusty main street, a gas station, an auto shop, a diner that looked like it hadn't served a meal in years. The place felt off. There were people around, but they didn't act like people should. They stood in groups, whispering to each other and glancing at me with these strange, hollow eyes. It was like they were waiting for something or someone. I pulled up to the auto shop and stepped out of the truck. A young man in a deputy's uniform was leaning against the building, chewing on a toothpick. He straightened up when he saw me. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "You lost?" "Not lost," I replied. "Just need some parts for my RV." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning me like he was trying to figure out if I belonged there or not. "You're not from around here?" "Nope," I said flatly, "just passing through." He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me with this strange intensity that made my skin crawl. "You should be careful," he said finally. "Stay tuned to proper frequencies while you're out here." I frowned at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged and looked away like he regretted saying anything at all. "Just don't mess with things you don't understand." Before I could press him further, an older man came out of the shop and asked what I needed. I gave him my list of parts and tried to shake off the weird feeling in my gut. By the time I got back to the RV, it was late afternoon. Maggie was sitting outside in a folding chair, staring out at the horizon like she was lost in thought. "You okay?" I asked as I walked up. She turned to me and smiled faintly. "Yeah, just tired." Leon came out of the RV then, carrying a cup of coffee like he owned the place. "Glad you're back," he said casually. "Maggie had a bit of a scare while you were gone." "What kind of scare?" I asked sharply. "She started fiddling with your radio equipment," he said with a shrug. "Next thing we know, she's talking about things that happened years ago, stuff from your past." He paused and gave me a strange look. Stuff she couldn't have known. Maggie looked embarrassed, but didn't deny it. "I don't remember much," she admitted quietly. "It's like something else took over for a minute." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to blame Leon. Maybe he'd done something while I was gone, but another part of me knew this wasn't his fault. That night, things got worse. We were all inside the RV when it happened. Every electronic device we had suddenly turned on at exactly midnight. The radio crackled to life, the TV buzzed with static, even Maggie's old wristwatch started beeping like crazy. And then we heard it, her voice. It came through the radio loud and clear, Maggie's voice, but she wasn't speaking into any microphone. Coordinates: 36 degrees 12:45 and 115 degrees 48:23. Her voice said over and over again in this cold mechanical tone that sent shivers down my spine. Maggie was sitting right next to me on the couch, fast asleep. Leon grabbed a map from one of the cabinets and spread it out on the table. His hands were shaking as he traced his finger across it. "Those coordinates," he muttered under his breath. "They're not far from here." I wanted to ignore it, to pretend none of this was happening, but something inside me couldn't let it go. "We're going," I said firmly. Leon looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you serious? After everything we've seen?" "Yes," I snapped. "Because if we don't figure out what's going on here, it's just going to keep getting worse." Maggie woke up then and stared at us with wide eyes like she already knew what we were talking about. The drive to those coordinates felt longer than it should have been. The desert seemed darker somehow, more menacing. Even Leon kept quiet for once, which only made everything feel more tense. When we finally arrived at our destination, a half-buried government facility surrounded by rusted fences and warning signs, it felt like stepping into another world entirely. The air was colder here, and there was this faint hum in the background that made my teeth ache. Victor recognized some of the equipment scattered around. It was military-grade radio gear from decades ago. "This is where it started," Leon whispered as we stepped inside, and deep down I knew he was right. The inside of the facility was like stepping into a tomb. The air was stale, and everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. Rusted machines lined the walls, their wires spilling out like veins from a corpse. The faint hum we'd heard outside was louder in here, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. Maggie stayed close to me, her hand gripping mine tightly. Leon walked ahead, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. None of us spoke. It felt like the walls were listening. We found a room at the end of a long hallway, its door hanging off one hinge. Inside were rows of old radio equipment, huge consoles with dials and switches, some still faintly glowing despite how long this place must have been abandoned. Papers were scattered across the floor, covered in diagrams and notes I couldn't make sense of. "This is military," I muttered, running my hand over one of the consoles. "I worked on stuff like this during the war." Leon picked up one of the papers and squinted at it. "What were they doing here? Something they shouldn't have," I replied grimly. That's when Maggie gasped. I turned to see her standing in front of a cracked mirror on the wall. She was staring at her reflection, or rather what was happening to it. Her skin was glowing faintly blue, thin lines spreading across her arms and neck like circuits. They pulsed with light, moving under her skin like they were alive. "Victor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening to me?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Leon stepped closer, his face pale. "This isn't normal," he said quietly. "No kidding," I snapped, more out of fear than anger. Maggie suddenly grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "I've been hearing it," she said in a rush. "The voice, ever since we got here." "What voice?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's in the radio," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It's inside me." Before I could say anything else, we heard footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. We all froze, turning toward the doorway. A man stepped into the room wearing a deputy's uniform. It was Franklin Lloyd, the young officer I'd met in town earlier that day, but something was wrong with him. His eyes glowed faintly blue, just like Maggie's skin, and when he spoke, his voice sounded distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker.
"Hulk?"
"You shouldn't have come here," he said flatly. Leon stepped forward cautiously. "What is this place? What's happening to her?" The deputy tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether or not to answer. Finally, he said, "This is where it began, the experiments." "What experiments?" I demanded. He looked at me then, his glowing eyes locking onto mine. "The government wanted to weaponize radio waves to use them to control people or even create life from nothing but energy." He paused, his voice dropping lower, "but they made something they couldn't control." "The entity," Leon whispered. The deputy nodded slowly. "It lives in the frequencies now, between stations where no one listens." He turned his gaze to Maggie and added, "and it needs hosts to fully exist." My stomach turned as his words sank in. Whatever this thing was, it had been using Maggie and maybe others too to build itself a physical form. Why her? I asked angrily. Because she's weak, he replied coldly. Sick. Maggie flinched at that and my heart broke for her. She hadn't told me much about what she was going through lately, but now it all made sense. The tiredness, the pale skin, she'd been hiding something from me. Before I could say anything else, Leon pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket and shoved it into my hands. I've been tracking this thing for months, he said urgently. It moves from place to place, leaving bodies behind, people with their nervous systems replaced by machines. I flipped through the pages quickly and saw sketches of symbols like the ones we'd found outside the RV earlier, circles with strange patterns inside them, and notes about missing persons who'd reported hearing strange radio transmissions before disappearing. This isn't just about Maggie, Leon continued. It's about all of us. The deputy took a step closer then, his movements jerky and unnatural like a puppet on strings. It's too late for you, he said simply. And then his body started to change. His skin split open along his arms and chest, revealing copper wires and metal components where muscle and bone should have been. His fingers twisted into sharp points as he lunged toward us with an unnatural speed. Run, Leon shouted. We bolted out of the room and down the hallway as fast as we could. The sound of metal scraping against concrete echoed behind us as the deputy chased after us. When we reached the entrance of the facility, we found ourselves face to face with an older woman holding a shotgun, a woman who looked like she belonged there somehow. Get inside, she barked at us before firing a shot down the hallway at whatever was chasing us. We didn't argue, just followed her back into another room where she slammed the door shut behind us and started barricading it with whatever she could find. Who are you? I asked breathlessly. Dr. Emily Westmore, she replied without looking up from what she was doing. And if you want to live through this night, you'll do exactly as I say. Dr. Westmore didn't waste any time. She moved quickly, pulling wires and old equipment from the shelves, her hands steady like she'd done this 1,000 times before. I stood there, still catching my breath, while Maggie leaned against the wall, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Leon kept glancing at the door, his fingers twitching nervously. What is that thing? I finally asked, breaking the silence. Doctor. Westmore looked up at me, her eyes sharp and serious. It's not a thing. It's a mistake. A mistake we made a long time ago. She paused for a moment, as if deciding how much to tell us. Back in the early 50s, this place was part of a government project. We were experimenting with radio waves, trying to see if we could use them to influence human behavior or even create artificial life. But we pushed too far. We created something that shouldn't exist. The entity, Leon said quietly. Dr. Westmore nodded. It started as nothing more than energy, just static in the air. But it learned. It grew. And now it's found a way to use us, our nervous systems, as a bridge into the physical world. I glanced at Maggie, who was sitting on the floor, now her head resting against the wall. The glowing lines on her skin were brighter than before, pulsing like they had their own heartbeat. How do we stop it? I asked. Dr. Westmore hesitated. We can't destroy it. Not completely, but we can disrupt it. Force it back into the frequencies where it came from. How? Leon pressed. She pointed to the equipment she'd been setting up, a tangled mess of wires and old radio parts that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. We create a feedback loop, she explained. A signal strong enough to overload its connection to this world. And what happens to Maggie? I asked, my voice shaking. Dr. Westmore didn't answer right away. She looked at Maggie, then back at me, her expression grim. If we're lucky, she said softly, we can sever its connection before it fully takes over. And if we're not lucky, Leon asked. Dr. Westmore didn't need to answer that one. Before we could say anything else, there was a loud crash from down the hallway, the sound of metal tearing and concrete crumbling. The deputy was coming for us. We don't have much time, Dr. Westmore said urgently. Sictor, I need your help setting this up. I nodded and stepped forward, my hands trembling as I started connecting wires and adjusting dials under her instructions. The hum in the air was getting louder now, vibrating through my skull like a live wire. Leon grabbed a heavy pipe from the corner of the room and stood by the door, his jaw clenched tight. "I'll hold him off as long as I can. You won't stand a chance," Dr. Westmore warned him. "I don't care," Leon shot back. "Just get that thing working."
See.
The next few minutes were a blur of motion and noise. The screech of metal as the deputy tore through the barricade, Leon shouting as he swung the pipe with everything he had, Maggie crying out in pain as the glowing line spread further across her body. Westmore flipped a switch on the console, and the room was filled with an ear-splitting screech, a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "It's working," she shouted over the noise. But then something went wrong. The deputy, if you could even call him that anymore, burst into the room, his body barely human now. His skin was gone entirely, replaced by copper wires and metal plates that sparked with electricity. He lunged at us with inhuman speed, knocking Leon aside like he was nothing. Before I could react, he grabbed Dr. Westmore by the arm and threw her across the room. She hit the wall hard and didn't get back up. "Victor!" Maggie screamed. I turned back to the console and realized what had to be done. The feedback loop wasn't strong enough. It needed more power to fully trap the entity in its own signal, and I was the only one who could give it that power. Without thinking, I grabbed one of the exposed wires and pressed it against my chest. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like being struck by lightning, but I held on anyway. The screeching sound grew louder and louder until it felt like my head was going to explode. The deputy froze mid-step, his body convulsing violently as sparks flew from every joint. Maggie crawled toward me, tears streaming down her face. "Victor, stop. You'll kill yourself." "I have to," I choked out through gritted teeth. "It's the only way." For a moment, everything went white, like someone had flipped a switch and erased the world around me. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the RV with Maggie leaning over me, her face streaked with tears but alive, and normal again. The glowing lines were gone from her skin. "Did we do it?" I asked weakly. She nodded, smiling through her tears. "It's gone." But as we drove away later that night, just me and Maggie in our old Airstream cruiser, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The radio crackled softly in the background as we talked about where to go next. Nothing unusual at first, but then I heard it, our voices coming through the speakers just seconds before we actually spoke them aloud. And I knew then that it wasn't over. Not really. My name is Jack Donovan, and I've spent most of my life studying wildlife, wolves to be exact. They've always fascinated me, the way they move, their loyalty to the pack, their survival instincts. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during that winter in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was supposed to be another research trip, just like any other. It wasn't. It all started when my wife Maria and I drove up to the research station in our old GMC motorhome. The blizzard hit hard that day, the kind of storm that makes you question your decisions. Snow came down in thick sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing. By the time we reached the station, it felt like we'd driven straight into a frozen wasteland. Maria was excited though. She's a photographer, always looking for beauty in the wild. "Think of the shots we'll get," she said, as she unpacked her camera gear. I smiled at her enthusiasm, but something about this trip felt off. We weren't alone at the station. Bill Hawkins, my research assistant, was already there waiting for us. Bill was a quiet guy, younger than me by a few years, but sharp and dedicated, or so I thought at the time. He greeted us with a grim look on his face. "Jack," he said, his voice low, "there's been talk around here. Missing hikers, locals seeing strange things in the woods, something white and tall." I frowned. "Wolves?" I asked. He shook his head. "Doesn't sound like wolves." That night, the temperature plummeted to an impossible low -70 degrees Fahrenheit. Even with the RV's heater running full blast, it felt like the cold was alive, creeping into every corner of our little space. Around midnight, Maria woke me up. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Listen." I sat up and strained my ears. At first, all I heard was the wind battering against the RV's walls. But then there it was, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow circling us. The next morning, we found strange footprints outside, long and narrow with claw-like impressions at the tips. They didn't look human or animal. They looked wrong. Maria spent the day taking pictures of the forest surrounding us, while Bill and I checked our equipment. The cold had cracked most of it overnight. Thermometers shattered, cameras frozen solid. Maria developed some of her photos later that evening, using her portable darkroom setup in the RV. "Jack," she called out from behind the curtain separating her workspace from our sleeping area. "You need to see this." I stepped over and looked at the photo she held up under a dim light bulb. My stomach dropped. Standing among the trees was a figure tall, impossibly thin, with antlers sprouting from its head like some twisted crown. Its body seemed stretched out of proportion, almost skeletal. "I didn't see this when I took the picture," Maria whispered. Neither had I. Later that day we met Elena Crow, an elder from the local Ojibwe community who lived nearby. She'd heard about our research and came to warn us. "You've come during the hunger moon," she said, matter-of-factly as she sipped tea in our RV's cramped kitchen area. "The hunger moon?" Maria asked. Elena nodded solemnly. "It's when winter is at its harshest, when food runs out and spirits grow restless." She paused before adding, "The Wendigo hunts during this time." I exchanged a glance with Maria and Bill but didn't say anything. Elena must have noticed our skepticism because she stood up and began painting symbols on our RV's doors and windows using ash from her pouch. "These will protect you," she said firmly, before leaving us alone again in that frozen wilderness. That night felt colder than ever before, not just physically but emotionally too. As if something unseen was watching us from just beyond our sight line. And deep down, I knew this trip was going to change everything. The storm didn't let up. By the second day we were completely cut off. No roads, no radio signals, just snow and silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. Maria stayed inside most of the day, wrapped in blankets and sipping tea. She said she felt cold, even though the heater was running full blast. I figured it was just the weather getting to her. I mean, who wouldn't feel cold in this kind of storm? Bill, on the other hand, seemed restless. He spent hours scribbling in his notebook, muttering to himself about Wendigo legends. I caught a glimpse of one page. It was filled with drawings of antlers and strange symbols. "Bill," I said, trying to sound casual. "You okay?" He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes. "You ever wonder what it feels like?" he asked. "What? What feels like?" I asked, confused. "To be starving," he said quietly. "To be so hungry you'd do anything." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and walked away. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. That night, things got worse. Maria woke up screaming, clutching her chest like she couldn't breathe. "I was dreaming," she gasped. "I was running through the snow, chasing someone. I could feel their fear. I could taste it." I held her close, trying to calm her down, but her skin felt ice cold. Her lips were turning blue, even though we were inside the heated RV. "Jack," she whispered, "something's wrong with me." I didn't know what to say because I was starting to feel it too. That creeping sense of dread, like we weren't alone out here. The next morning, I stepped outside to check on the generator. That's when I saw them, wolf carcasses. At least a dozen of them scattered around our campsite in a perfect circle. Their rib cages were torn open, their organs missing. It wasn't just random, it was deliberate, like someone or something had arranged them that way. I ran back inside and told Maria and Bill what I'd seen. Maria looked horrified, but Bill, he just nodded like he'd been expecting it. "It's marking its territory," he said simply. "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "The Wendigo," he replied calmly. "It's letting us know we're in its hunting ground." Before I could argue with him, we heard a knock at the door, 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through the RV like gunshots. I opened the door to find Officer Peterson standing there, covered in snow and shivering violently. "Thank God," he said, as he stumbled inside. "I've been driving these roads for hours trying to find anyone still out here." We gave him a blanket and some hot coffee while he told us what was happening in town. "People are losing it," he said grimly. "Neighbors turning on each other, folks walking out into the blizzard without coats or shoes. It's like something's gotten into them." He paused before adding, "And then there are the disappearances." "What kind of disappearances?" Maria asked nervously. "Hunters," Peterson replied. "Hikers. Even some locals who've lived here their whole lives, just gone without a trace." As he spoke, Maria started coughing, a deep, rattling sound that made my stomach twist. When she pulled her hand away from her mouth, there was blood on her palm. "We need to get her to a hospital," Peterson said immediately. "We can't," Bill interjected before I could respond. "The roads are buried under 6 feet of snow." Peterson looked at him sharply. "Then we'll dig our way out if we have to." But deep down, I knew there was no digging our way out of this, not from the snowstorm and not from whatever had followed us into these woods. That night, as the blizzard raged outside, our radio crackled to life for the first time in days. At first, it was just static, but then we heard a voice, a woman's voice speaking in Ojibwe. "What's she saying?" Maria whispered. Bill translated softly. "She's counting down." "To what?" I asked. He didn't answer. The storm didn't let up, and neither did the strange feeling in the air. It was like the blizzard wasn't just weather. It was alive, pressing down on us, keeping us trapped. Maria was getting worse. She barely spoke anymore, and her skin was pale, almost gray. Every time I looked at her, I felt a pang of fear. She wasn't herself. Bill had changed too. He spent most of his time outside now, wandering around in the snow like he was searching for something. When I asked him what he was doing, he just shrugged and said, "Looking for answers." One night, I woke up to find him standing at the RV's window, staring out into the darkness. He didn't turn around. "It's out there," he whispered, "watching us." I walked over to him and looked outside, but all I could see was snow blowing in the wind. "You need to get some sleep," I said firmly. He finally turned to face me, and that's when I noticed his eyes. They were bloodshot and sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. His cheeks looked hollow, and his lips were cracked from the cold. "I'm fine," he muttered, before heading back to his bunk. The next morning, Bill was gone. His coat and boots were missing, along with his notebook. Maria was too weak to get out of bed, so Peterson and I went out to look for him. We followed his footprints through the snow for about a mile before they suddenly stopped. Just stopped, like he'd vanished into thin air. No signs of struggle, no other tracks nearby, nothing. "Where did he go?" Peterson asked, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. When we got back to the RV, Maria was sitting up in bed for the first time in days, but something about her didn't look right. Her arms seemed longer than they should be, and her fingers looked thin and bony. "Jack," she said quietly, "I'm so hungry." I handed her a bowl of soup we'd warmed up on the stove. She took one sip before pushing it away. "Not this kind of hungry," she whispered. That's when I noticed her teeth. Some of them had fallen out overnight, replaced by sharp ones that looked almost animal-like. Peterson backed away from her slowly. "What's happening to her?" he asked. Before I could answer, we heard a loud thud outside. Peterson grabbed his gun and opened the door cautiously. Standing there in the snow was Bill, or what used to be Bill. His body was twisted and stretched out of proportion. Antlers sprouted from his head like branches from a tree. His skin was pale and tight against his bones, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Bill," I said hesitantly. He tilted his head at me like he didn't understand the name anymore. Then he lunged forward with an unnatural speed. Peterson fired his gun twice before slamming the door shut. "What the hell is that thing?" he shouted. It's him, I said quietly.
It's Bill.
Maria started coughing again, deep, rattling coughs that shook her whole body. When she looked up at me, her eyes weren't hers anymore. They were black as coal. I think it's happening to me too, she whispered. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. Whatever had taken Bill was taking Maria now too. Before we could figure out what to do next, the radio crackled again. This time it wasn't static. It was Elena's voice. You must renew the protection, she said urgently. The symbols will hold them back, but only if you offer blood. What does that mean? Peterson asked nervously. Elena continued speaking. One must take its place. Elena's words echoed in my head. Peter, one must take its place. I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I knew one thing. Time was running out. Maria was slipping away, and Bill wasn't human anymore. Peterson paced back and forth, gripping his gun tightly.
We can't just sit here,
he said. We need to do something. I nodded, but my mind was racing. What could we do? The symbols Elena had painted on the RV were the only thing keeping Bill, or whatever he'd become, out. But they wouldn't hold forever. The frost on the inside of the RV's walls was growing thicker by the hour, as if the storm itself was closing in on us. Maria sat on the bed staring at her hands. Her fingers had grown longer, her nails sharper. She looked up at me with tears in her blackened eyes. Jack, she whispered, I don't want to hurt you. You won't, I said firmly, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. The radio crackled again, and Elena's voice came through once more. The Wendigo must always have a host, she said. It cannot be destroyed, only transferred. Peterson frowned. What does that mean? Someone has to take its place, I said quietly. Maria shook her head violently. She said, he can't. Before I could respond, there was another loud thud outside, then another, and another. It was Bill or the Wendigo slamming against the RV, trying to break through the symbols. We don't have much time, Peterson said. I grabbed Maria's hands and looked into her eyes. Listen to me, I said. We're going to fix this. You're going to be okay. She shook her head again, tears streaming down her face. Jack, I can feel it inside me. It's not going to stop. Elena's voice came through the radio one last time. The ritual must be completed before dawn. I stood up and grabbed my coat. Peterson looked at me like I'd lost my mind. What are you doing? He asked. I'm ending this, I said. No, Maria said weakly. Please don't. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. I love you, I whispered. Before anyone could stop me, I opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing the breath from my lungs. The snow stung my face as I walked toward Bill, or what was left of him. His antlers gleamed in the moonlight, and his glowing eyes locked onto mine. Come on, I shouted, spreading my arms wide. Take me. For a moment, everything went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Bill lunged at me, but before he could reach me, Elena appeared out of nowhere, standing between us with her arms raised high. She chanted something in Ojibwe, her voice strong and steady despite the storm. Bill froze in place, his body trembling violently, as if he were fighting against something unseen. Elena, I shouted over the wind. What are you doing? She turned to look at me with a sad smile on her face. It has to be done, she said simply. Before I could stop her, she slashed her palm with a knife and pressed it against Bill's chest. The symbols she'd painted on him began to glow faintly as he let out an ear-piercing scream. And then, silence. When it was over, Elena collapsed into the snow beside Bill's lifeless body. Her breathing was shallow, but she managed to whisper one last thing. Spirit is contained for now. I carried her back to the RV, but it was too late. She was gone by the time we got inside. Maria's transformation had stopped completely. Her skin returned to its normal color, and her eyes were no longer black. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and guilt. You saved me, she said softly. But all I could think about was Elena and what she'd sacrificed to save us all. When spring came and the snow finally melted, investigators found our RV abandoned in the woods. Inside, they found Elena's frozen body surrounded by ritual materials and 2 sets of footprints leading deep into the forest. One set belonged to Bill, or whatever he'd become. They were mine. My name is Bobby Mitchell, and this story isn't something I ever thought I'd have to share. It's about what happened to my family during a trip to Hollow Creek in West Virginia. I thought it would be a quiet getaway, time to relax, do some research for my book, and spend time with my wife Patty and our son Timmy. But what started as a family vacation turned into something I still can't fully explain. We arrived at Hollow Creek Campground on a crisp autumn afternoon in our old VW bus camper. The trees were painted in shades of orange and red, and the air smelled of dry leaves and wood smoke. Timmy was excited, running around the campsite while Patty unpacked. I was setting up my recording equipment. I've been working on a book about Appalachian mining legends, and this place seemed perfect for gathering stories. While exploring near the edge of our campsite, Timmy found something strange, a small hole in the ground, perfectly round and dark as night. He called me over, asking if I thought it might be a rabbit hole or something. But when he dropped a rock inside, we waited and waited, but no sound came back. That night, as we settled into the camper for bed, strange tapping sounds started coming from underneath the RV. At first, I thought it might be raccoons or some other animal. But when I went outside to check, I found claw marks scratched into the dirt beneath the vehicle and coal dust scattered around the ground. The campground was miles away from any active mines, so it didn't make sense. The next morning, Timmy started acting different. He said he'd been dreaming about the skinny friend who visited him at night and lived in the walls of the world. He even drew pictures of it, long arms, stick-thin legs, and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through you. Patty tried to brush it off as just his imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that day, I went into town to talk to some locals about mining legends for my book. That's when I first heard about the Hollow Men, the miners who were trapped underground during a collapse in 1898. According to the legend, they survived by doing unspeakable things and eventually became something else entirely. People around here still leave offerings of food at old mine entrances to keep them appeased. When I got back to camp that evening, Patty looked worried. She said Timmy had been sleepwalking toward the woods last night and muttering strange things under his breath. She touched him to wake him up and swore she saw just for a moment what he was seeing, a distorted view of the campground like it was stretched through some tunnel or crack in reality. That night was worse than the first. We heard faint whispers coming from inside the camper when no one was talking, and our food started disappearing from the cabinets without explanation. Coal dust handprints appeared on surfaces we hadn't touched, tiny handprints that didn't match any of ours. I decided to play back some recordings from my equipment to see if anything strange had been captured. What I heard made my blood run cold, voices whispering about Timmy, his name repeated over and over like they were calling him, and when played backward, they gave directions to an abandoned mine shaft nearby. I didn't know what we were dealing with yet, but deep down I knew we weren't alone anymore. The next morning, I woke up to find Patty sitting at the small table in the camper, staring at one of Timmy's drawings. She didn't even notice me at first. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and said, "I don't think this is just his imagination, Bobby." The drawing was of our camper, but it wasn't normal. The walls were stretched thin, like they were made of rubber, and inside was a tall black figure with arms so long they touched the floor. Timmy had drawn himself standing next to it, holding its hand like they were friends. That night, Patty and I decided to take turns staying up to watch Timmy. We didn't want him sleepwalking again, or worse, wandering off into the woods. Around midnight, while Patty was asleep, I heard soft footsteps. My heart sank as I turned and saw Timmy walking toward the door. "Timmy," I whispered, trying not to scare him. He didn't respond. His eyes were open but blank, like he wasn't really there. I gently grabbed his shoulder to stop him, and the moment I touched him, everything changed. For a split second, It felt like I was somewhere else. Somewhere dark and cold. The air smelled like damp earth and coal dust, and I could hear faint whispers all around me. It only lasted a moment before I snapped back to the camper, but it left me shaking. Timmy blinked a few times and looked up at me like nothing had happened. "What's wrong, Daddy?" he asked innocently. The next day we met an old man named Jenkins while walking near the woods. He was hunched over and carried a small basket filled with bread and fruit. He told us he was leaving offerings at an old mine entrance nearby to keep them happy. When I asked him what he meant by them, he gave me a long look before saying, "The hollow men don't forget who trespasses in their land." Jenkins explained that the miners from 1898 had practiced strange rituals underground, things they believed would protect them from cave-ins or starvation. But when the mine collapsed, those rituals trapped them between worlds. They weren't alive anymore, but they weren't dead either. That evening, we noticed more strange things happening in the camper. Our food kept disappearing, even though we hadn't left it open or touched it all day. Coal dust handprints appeared on the walls, this time higher up where even Patty or I couldn't reach without standing on something. Patty found one of Timmy's toys wedged in a narrow crack between the cabinets where it couldn't have possibly fit unless someone or something had forced it there. I decided to check my recording equipment again that night to see if anything else had been captured. This time the whispers were louder and clearer. They weren't just saying Timmy's name anymore. They were talking about how he was marked and how the walls are thin for him. My stomach turned when I realized they were talking about taking him somewhere we couldn't follow. That night, Ranger Williams came by our campsite unexpectedly. She seemed nervous and kept glancing at Timmy's drawings pinned up near his bed. "You need to leave," she said bluntly. "This place isn't safe for families." When I pressed her for answers, she hesitated before finally admitting that her family had been connected to the mines for generations. Her great-grandfather was one of the miners who survived but came back different. She said her family had been watching over Hollow Creek ever since to make sure no one disturbed what was left behind underground. Before she left that night, I saw her sneaking around our campsite with a small pouch of something, maybe salt or herbs, and drawing strange symbols near our camper's tire. On doors. She didn't say what they were for, but judging by how pale her face was when she finished, I knew things were about to get worse. The night everything changed started like any other. Patty and I were exhausted from keeping an eye on Timmy, but we didn't dare let our guard down. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the camper door creaking open. My heart dropped. I jumped out of bed and saw that Timmy was gone. Patty woke up too, panic written all over her face. We ran outside, shouting his name into the cold night air. That's when I saw it. A trail of Timmy's toys leading toward the woods, each one placed neatly on the ground like breadcrumbs. We followed the trail until it stopped at a mine shaft entrance. Small, barely big enough for a child to fit through. The opening was surrounded by coal dust and claw marks, and the air coming from inside was freezing cold, like stepping into a refrigerator. Ranger Williams appeared out of nowhere, flashlight in hand. "He's inside," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "They've taken him." Patty started crying, but Williams grabbed her shoulders and said firmly, "We can still get him back, but we have to move fast." Old man Jenkins showed up moments later, carrying his basket of offerings and muttering prayer under his breath. "I told you they don't forget," he said grimly. They marked the boy. With no time to waste, we climbed into the mine shaft one by one, Williams leading the way, Jenkins behind her, then me and Patty. The walls were tight and jagged, forcing us to crawl in some places. Every sound echoed around us, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the drip of water from somewhere deep below, and it felt like the darkness was alive, pressing in closer with every step. As we moved deeper into the tunnels, things started to feel wrong. The walls seemed to shift behind us, closing off passages we'd just walked through. It became impossible to tell which way was forward or backward. The mine was twisting itself around us like it didn't want us to leave. Then we saw them. At first they looked like shadows, coal-black figures standing perfectly still in the distance. But when we turned away for even a second, they moved closer. Their limbs were impossibly thin and long, bending at unnatural angles as they crept toward us silently. "Don't look away," Williams whispered urgently. "They only move when you're not watching." We finally reached a massive underground chamber filled with dozens of those figures, statues frozen in place, but I could feel their hollow eyes watching us even though they didn't move. In the center of the chamber was Timmy, sitting on the ground unharmed but covered in coal dust handprints from head to toe. He looked up at me with wide eyes and said calmly, "They just wanted a friend, Daddy. They showed me their shortcuts." Before I could grab him, Jenkins screamed behind us as one of the figures lunged forward and dragged him into a crack in the wall, a crack far too small for a person to fit through. The sound of his bones breaking echoed through the chamber as he disappeared into the darkness. Williams pulled out a knife and cut her palm open, using her blood to draw symbols on the ground around Timmy, while shouting something I couldn't understand, words that sounded ancient and raw, like they didn't belong in this world. "We have to go," she yelled as more figures began moving toward us. With Timmy in my arms and Patty clutching my hand tightly, we ran back through the tunnels as fast as we could while Williams stayed behind to hold them off. The walls kept shifting around us, trying to trap us inside, but somehow we found our way back to the surface just as the mine began collapsing behind us. When we reached our camper and drove away from Hollow Creek as fast as possible, I thought it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. We didn't stop driving until the sun came up. Patty sat in the passenger seat, clutching Timmy tightly, while I kept my eyes on the road. None of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, like we were all too afraid to say what we were thinking. Timmy seemed fine. He wasn't hurt, and he didn't act scared or confused. If anything, he seemed calm. Too calm for a kid who had just been dragged into a mine by something that shouldn't exist. When we got home, I tried to convince myself it was over. I told myself we were safe now, far away from Hollow Creek and whatever lived down there. But things didn't go back to normal. At first, it was little things, shadows that didn't look quite right, faint tapping sounds coming from inside the walls, and the feeling that someone was watching us even when we were alone. One night, Patty woke me up in a panic. "Bobby," she whispered, her voice shaking, "look at Timmy." I turned and saw him standing in the corner of his room, staring at the wall with his arms stretched out into a narrow crack between the dresser and the wall. His arm was bent in a way that shouldn't have been possible, longer than it should have been, and he was humming softly to himself. "Timmy?" I said cautiously, stepping closer. He turned to look at me, his face innocent as ever. "I'm just playing with them," he said with a smile. "They followed us through the shortcuts." I froze. Patty grabbed him and pulled him away from the wall, but when she did, coal dust spilled out of the crack onto the floor. After that night, I started noticing more holes around the house, small, perfectly round ones, like the one Timmy found at Hollow Creek. They were in places they shouldn't be, behind furniture, inside cabinets, even in the basement walls. One evening, I went down to the basement to check on something and saw it, a hole in the far wall about the size of a fist. I walked over slowly and crouched down to look inside. At first, all I saw was darkness. But then, something moved. A single coal-black eye stared back at me from inside the hole, unblinking and hollow. My breath caught in my throat as I heard Timmy's voice whisper softly from behind me. "They're here now, Daddy." I turned around to see him standing at the top of the basement stair. His shadow stretched long across the walls, like it didn't belong to him anymore. That's when I realized we hadn't escaped Hollow Creek at all. It had followed us home. My name is Douglas Hoffman. I'm 42 years old, recently divorced, and honestly, just trying to figure out what's next in life. After the mess of my marriage falling apart, I needed some time away from everything. People, work, and all the noise. That's how I ended up here, at Whispering Pines Campground in northern Minnesota. It's late September, and the season is winding down. The campground is almost empty, which is exactly what I wanted, peace and quiet. I drove up here in my new pride and joy, a 1971 Winnebago Brave. Well, it's not new, but it's mine. It's got this retro look with orange stripes on the side, and when I saw it for sale a few weeks ago, I thought, why not? It felt like a fresh start, a little adventure. When I arrived at the campground that afternoon, the air was crisp and cool. The trees were starting to turn shades of gold and red, and there was this stillness in the air that felt different, like the forest was holding its breath. I parked the RV in one of the more secluded spots near the edge of the woods and started setting up camp. While I was unpacking, something caught my eye on one of the trees nearby, some strange carvings etched into the bark. They weren't like initials or hearts that people sometimes carve into trees. These were symbols, almost like runes or something you'd see in an old book. At first I thought maybe it was just some kids messing around or some kind of local art thing. I took a picture of them with my camera, just out of curiosity, and went back to setting up. That first night was when things started to feel off. I was sitting inside the RV after dinner, reading a book with a cup of coffee when I heard it, a voice outside. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe someone else at the campground. But then I froze because I recognized it. It sounded exactly like my ex-wife, Lisa. Douglas. She called out softly from the woods. Douglas, come here. I put down my book and stared at the door of the RV. My heart started pounding because there was no way Lisa could be here. She didn't even know where I'd gone, but her voice sounded so real, so close. Douglas, please. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside before I could think twice about it. The air was colder than before, and the forest seemed darker than it should have been under the moonlight. The voice called again, further into the trees this time. Douglas. I don't know what came over me. I followed it. Every step felt heavier, as if something in me was screaming to turn back, but her voice kept pulling me forward. After a few minutes of walking into the woods, everything started to look unfamiliar. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting in strange ways overhead. That's when I realized I was lost. My flashlight flickered for a moment before going out completely. Panic set in as I turned around, trying to find my way back to the RV. The voice had stopped now, replaced by this eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I stumbled back into the clearing where my RV was parked. Relief washed over me as I climbed inside and locked the door behind me. But then, I saw them. Muddy footprints on the floor, leading from the door to where I had been sitting early. They weren't mine. They were too small for my boots and looked fresh, as if someone had been inside while I was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, while filling up water at one of the communal pumps near the campground office, I met someone, a woman named Elaine Turner. She looked to be around my age, with short brown hair tucked under a knit cap and a camera slung around her neck. Morning, she said with a warm smile as she pumped water into her jug. You here for camping or photography? Camping, I replied cautiously. You? Photography, she said, holding up her camera like proof. I'm working on a wildlife piece for a magazine. We chatted for a bit, small talk mostly, but there was something about her that felt familiar somehow. She mentioned this was her first time here at Whispering Pines, but she seemed to know more about the area than she let on. As we talked, her eyes drifted toward my RV parked in the distance. You're parked pretty close to the woods, she said casually. Ever hear anything strange out there? Her question caught me off guard. What do you mean by strange? I asked cautiously. She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head with a small laugh. Never mind, she said lightly, as if brushing off her own question. It's probably nothing, but something about her tone told me she knew more than she was saying. Later that day, while sitting inside my RV trying to tune into some music on my old radio, something strange happened again. The static on one of the channels suddenly shifted into voices, familiar voices. It wasn't music or even random chatter. It was *me*. My own voice coming through from years ago, conversations I'd had with Lisa back when we were still married. Do you remember our first trip up north? Lisa's voice crackled through the speakers like an old recording. My stomach dropped as memories flooded back, the exact words we'd spoken during that trip almost 10 years ago, now playing back at me through static-filled speakers. I turned off the radio immediately and sat there in silence for what felt like hours. Something wasn't right about this place, and deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't just paranoia. It was this heavy, pressing sensation like the forest itself had eyes. I decided to distract myself by exploring the campground a little more. Maybe some fresh air and a walk would clear my head. That's when I met Marcus Walker. He was sitting on an old wooden bench near the campground office, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. Marcus looked to be in his 60s, with a scruffy beard and a tattered flannel shirt that had seen better days. He gave me a nod as I walked by. "You're new here," he said without looking up from his work. "Yeah," I replied, stopping a few feet away. "Just camping for a few days." Marcus chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "You picked the wrong place for peace and quiet." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He finally looked up at me, his eyes sharp and serious. "This forest, it's not like other places. There's something old here, something that doesn't like visitors." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as the ramblings of an eccentric local, but the way he said it, so calm and certain, sent a chill down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I asked cautiously. Marcus leaned back on the bench and gestured toward the woods with his knife. "The echo stalker," he said simply. "That's what we call it around here. It lives between the trees, feeding on memories and people." I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile or say he was joking, but he didn't. "Look," he continued, "I'm not saying you have to believe me, but if you start hearing voices or seeing things that don't make sense, don't follow them. And whatever you do, don't go deeper into the forest." I nodded politely and walked away, but his words stuck with me. The echo stalker? It sounded like something out of a campfire story, but after everything that had happened since I arrived, the voice in the woods, the footprints in my RV, I couldn't completely dismiss it. That night, things got worse. I woke up around midnight to a strange sound outside, like someone whispering just beyond the RV walls. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Douglas, come outside." It wasn't Lisa's voice this time, it was mine. I froze in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ear. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. "Douglas, come outside." I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept toward the window. Peeking through the curtain, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was someone standing at the edge of the forest, a man who looked exactly like me. He was wearing the same clothes I'd worn yesterday, his posture and movements eerily familiar. But there was something off about him. His face was pale and slightly blurred, like an out-of-focus photograph. He raised his hand and waved at me slowly before stepping back into the shadows of the trees. I stumbled away from the window, breathing hard. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination or dream. But when I looked down at my hands, they were trembling too much for it to be anything but real. The whispers stopped after that, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Elaine showed up at my RV with her camera slung over her shoulder and a concerned look on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a faint smile as she handed me a thermos of coffee. "Something like that," I muttered, taking a sip of the coffee gratefully. We ended up talking for most of the morning about her photography work, her travels, and eventually about what had been happening here at Whispering Pines. "I've been hearing things too," she admitted quietly after some hesitation. "Voices, sounds, even smells that remind me of people I've lost." Her words sent a shiver through me. "Do you think it's just stress? Or maybe this place is messing with our heads?" Elaine shook her head firmly. "No," she said. "It's not just in our heads." She told me about an article she'd read years ago about this area, about strange disappearances and sightings of something unnatural in these woods. She'd come here partly for her photography work, but also because she wanted answers about what happened to her brother who disappeared in these woods years ago. Her story made my stomach churn because it lined up too closely with what Marcus had told me earlier about the echo stalker. As we talked, we decided to take a closer look at those symbols carved into the trees near my campsite. Maybe they were connected somehow, warnings or markers left by someone who knew more than we did. When we got to one of the trees with carvings on it, Elaine took out her camera and started snapping pictures while I examined them more closely. The symbols were intricate and precise, definitely not random vandalism like I'd first thought. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from somewhere deeper in the forest, a sound like a tree branch snapping under pressure. We both froze and turned toward the noise. "Did you hear that?" Elaine whispered nervously. Before I could answer, another sound followed, a low growl that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. "We should go," I said quickly, grabbing her arm and pulling her back toward the RV. That night, things escalated even further when we discovered something terrifying. My RV had moved closer to the forest edge without either of us driving it there, and its gas tank was completely empty despite being full earlier that day. Elaine looked at me with wide eyes as we stood outside staring at the tire tracks leading directly toward the woods. "This isn't normal," she whispered, shakily. "Something is playing with us," and deep down, I knew she was right. By the third day, I was running on fumes mentally and physically. The strange noises, the voices, the RV moving on its own, none of it made sense. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something unnatural was happening here. Elaine stayed close to me that morning. We both felt safer together, though neither of us would admit it out loud. She suggested we try talking to Marcus again. Maybe he knew more than he'd let on the first time. When we found him near the same bench as before, Marcus looked worse than he had the day before. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling as he whittled another piece of wood. "You're still here," he said without looking up. "We need answers," Elaine replied firmly. "What is this echo stalker you were talking about? What's really going on in these woods?" Marcus sighed heavily and set down his knife. "It's not something you can fight," he said quietly. "It's not even something you can understand. It's been here longer than any of us, longer than this campground, longer than the towns nearby." He pointed toward the forest with a shaky hand. "It doesn't just take people, it takes who they are. Their memories, their voices, everything that makes them human. And when it's done, it leaves behind something that looks like them but isn't." His words sent a chill through me. I thought about the figure I'd seen in the woods, the one that looked exactly like me, and felt my stomach turn. "Why hasn't anyone stopped it?" Elaine asked sharply. Marcus shook his head. "You can't stop it," he said simply. "The best you can do is stay away from it, or leave offerings at the edge of the forest to keep it appeased." "Offerings," I repeated, confused. "Food, trinkets, anything personal," Marcus explained. "Something that has meaning to you. It likes things tied to memories." Elaine frowned and glanced at me. "That's why it's messing with us," she said softly. "It's feeding on our memories." Before Marcus could say anything else, there was a sudden rustling in the trees behind him, a sound like leaves and branches moving unnaturally fast. Marcus froze for a moment before standing up abruptly. "You need to leave," he said urgently, his voice trembling. "Now." But before we could move, something happened that I'll never forget for as long as I live. The ground beneath Marcus shifted, roots bursting out of the soil and wrapping around his legs like living snakes. He screamed and tried to pull away, but the roots tightened their grip, dragging him toward the forest. "Help me," he shouted desperately. Elaine and I ran toward him instinctively, but before we could reach him, more roots shot out from the ground, twisting and curling around his arms and torso until he was completely immobilized. His screams echoed through the trees as he was pulled deeper into the woods, and then they stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than his screams because it wasn't really silence at all. It was whispers coming from every direction at once. "Douglas." "Elaine." The voices called softly, blending together like wind through the leaves. We stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity before Elaine grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the RV. "We're leaving," she said firmly, her voice shaking. But when we tried to drive away later that afternoon, we realized something horrifying. The road leading out of Whispering Pines wasn't there anymore. No matter which direction we drove or how many turns we took, we kept ending up back at my campsite. It's trapping us, Elaine whispered as we sat in the RV trying to figure out what to do next. As if things couldn't get worse, Sheriff Roy Bennett showed up later that evening, but something about him wasn't right. I'd met Roy briefly when I first arrived at Whispering Pines. He'd seemed like a normal guy back then, a little gruff but friendly enough. Now, though, there was something off about him. He pulled up in his patrol car and stepped out slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. When he saw me standing outside the RV with Elaine, his face twisted into an expression of anger, or maybe confusion. "You're not supposed to be here," he said coldly as he approached us. "What are you talking about?" I asked nervously. Roy narrowed his eyes at me. "I called your Park Service office," he said sharply. "They don't have anyone named Douglas Hoffman working for them." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "That's not possible," I stammered. "Shueth. I've worked there for 15 years. Roy didn't seem convinced, and then things got even stranger. He opened the back door of his patrol car and gestured for someone inside to step out, and when they did, my heart stopped. It was at Nick, another version of me wearing different clothes but with the same face and voice. "This is Douglas Hoffman," Roy said firmly as he pointed at my duplicate. "You're an imposter." Elaine gasped beside me as I stumbled backward in shock. The other version of me stared at me blankly before speaking in a flat, monotone voice. "You don't belong here." Before Roy could arrest me, or whatever he planned to do, I bolted toward the RV with Elaine close behind me. Inside, things were even worse. The walls were pulsing with strange energy patterns that looked almost alive, flickering with flashes of light carrying fragments of my own memories. Childhood birthdays, my wedding day, even moments from this trip flashing by like a slideshow gone wrong. Elaine grabbed my arm tightly and whispered urgently, "It's using your memories against you." I didn't know what to say or what to do, but one thing was clear: we couldn't stay here much longer without losing ourselves completely. Elaine and I sat in the RV, trying to figure out what to do. The walls kept pulsing with those strange patterns like veins carrying electricity, and every time I looked at them I saw flashes of my past. It wasn't just memories anymore, it was like the RV itself had become alive, feeding on everything I'd ever been. "We can't stay here," Elaine said quietly, her voice trembling. "It's taking you piece by piece." I nodded but didn't know where to go. The road kept looping back to the campsite, and the forest seemed to close in tighter every time we tried to leave. Then Elaine said something that caught me off guard. "The symbols," she whispered. "They're not random. They're a containment system." I stared at her blankly. "What are you talking about?" She grabbed her camera and started flipping through the pictures she'd taken of the carvings on the trees earlier. "Look," she said urgently, pointing at one of the images. "These symbols, they're part of a pattern. If we complete it around the campsite, we might be able to trap whatever this thing is." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. We grabbed a knife and started carving the missing pieces of the pattern into nearby trees, working as fast as we could while the forest seemed to come alive around us. The wind picked up, whipping through the branches like angry whispers, and shadows danced across the ground even though there was no light source. As we worked, Sheriff Bennett returned, but he wasn't himself anymore. His skin rippled unnaturally as if something was moving beneath it, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. He stepped toward us slowly, his movements jerky and wrong. "You can't stop it," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. It was layered with other voices, like dozens of people speaking at once. Elaine screamed as Bennett lunged at her, but I managed to shove him away before he could grab her. He stumbled back into one of the trees we'd carved into, and for a moment, his body seemed to flicker, like he was caught between being human and something else. "We have to finish this," Elaine shouted as she ran to another tree. I followed her, carving frantically while Bennett staggered toward us again. The forest itself seemed to fight us, roots bursting out of the ground to trip us up, branches reaching down like claws. Then I saw it, the thing Marcus had warned us about. It emerged from the shadows of the trees, a mass of twisted human-like figures fused together into one horrifying shape. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, their hands reaching out as if begging for help. The Echo Stalker. It moved slowly but deliberately toward us, its presence making the air feel heavy and cold. Every step it took seemed to drain something from me, my energy, my thoughts, my very sense of self. Elaine screamed as one of its twisted limbs reached for her. "Douglas, finish it." I looked down at the final symbol we needed to carve, a circle that would complete the pattern, and realized what had to be done. The only way to finish it was for me to sacrifice myself. I didn't know how I knew that. It was like the forest itself whispered it into my mind. But there was no other choice. If I didn't do this, Elaine wouldn't survive, and neither would anyone else who came here after us. "Go," I shouted at Elaine as I stepped toward the final tree. "Get out of here." "No," she screamed, running toward me. But before she could stop me, roots burst out of the ground and wrapped around her legs, holding her back as if protecting her from what was about to happen. I carved the final symbol into the tree with shaking hands as the Echo Stalker loomed closer. Its twisted faces stared at me with hollow eyes, its voices whispering things I couldn't understand but felt deep in my soul. As I finished carving the symbol, I felt my memories start to drain away, flashes of my childhood, my wedding day, even this moment disappearing into the trees around me. The Echo Stalker let out a deafening scream as it was pulled back into the forest by some invisible force, the symbols glowing faintly on each tree before fading into silence. Elaine broke free from the roots holding her and ran toward me just as I collapsed against the tree. "Douglas," she cried, shaking me desperately. But when I looked up at her, I wasn't really *me* anymore. My memories were gone, my sense of self erased completely, and all that was left was an empty shell of who I used to be. 6 months later, Whispering Pines campground was officially closed after multiple disappearances were reported in the area, including Marcus Walker and Sheriff Bennett. Elaine survived but refused to talk about what happened there, except to warn people never to go near those woods again. One spring afternoon, a new camper arrived at Whispering Pines despite its closure signs, a young man looking for solitude just like I had been months ago. He met a friendly park ranger near the entrance who introduced himself with a smile. "Name's Douglas Hoffman." But something about his eyes, his movements, wasn't quite right.